afternoon, everybody. I think we'll get started with our afternoon's program today. It's my very great pleasure to introduce two wonderful scholars working on very different regions and historical periods who are going to share their insights in a collaborative project on the role of art in revolutionary movements and the influence of revolutionary movements on art. So the title of our program today is Art in a Time of Revolution. Our first speaker will be Zara Anishlanson, from the University of Delaware. She has a background in both history of art and in early American history. She's consulted on exhibitions at the Library of Congress, appeared on the Travel Channel, which is something I'm very intrigued about, and I'd like to hear more about that experience, and recently published A Portrait of a Woman in Silk, Hidden Histories of the British Atlantic World. So Zara is in great demand in programs all around the world who are investigating revolutionary ideology, and the role of art in material culture. She's got a bunch of really interesting projects forthcoming on using material culture and understanding American history. And today she'll be sharing her insights on understanding the American Revolution more deeply through art and material objects. Our other speaker, I'll introduce him now, and I'll let him come up after Zara's finished, is John Muir, who's a professor of history at the University of Puget Sound, where he specializes in modern Latin America. His books include Workers, Neighbors, and Citizens, Revolution in Mexico City, and Picturing the Proletariat, Artists and Labor in Revolutionary Mexico. So I think we'll get to hear about art in two different periods and two very distinctive revolutions. And our third presenter is Byron Hammond, who's in our own History of Art department here at Ohio State University. He also has an incredibly broad portfolio that includes art of Mesoamerica, art in colonial and in the colonial period of Mexico and Latin America. So I thought he was really well equipped to talk to both of our speakers today. And he'll also be facilitating the questions that I hope you'll have, and I'm sure you'll have after this very stimulating program. So join me in thanking and welcoming our first presenter, Zara Anishlanson.
Thank you. So how is the mic situation? Can everyone hear me in the back? Yes, excellent. So thank you, Margaret, for that lovely introduction and for the invitation to come here. I was saying to John earlier today that it's not often that we get the chance to, as historians, to speak across chronology and geographic divide, even though I'm someone who considers myself to be an Atlantic world historian. Even that has its own limitations in terms of geographies that are breached. So this to me is a very rare treat to be able to discuss revolution across space and time, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. And thank Byron in advance for his thoughts. Which I will say that since this is, you are I think only the second group to hear about this, and the first group to hear about this, so sorry if it's not fully baked, it's meant to not be fully baked, so I really welcome your questions and comments. The first group to hear about it was one of the places where I've done a lot of the initial research for this, which is the Washington Library at Mount Vernon. And so there, obviously, I was focusing on the part of the story that's related to their collections and to the archives there that I was using. Today, what I'm going to try to do, and you are the first audience to hear this, is put together that piece of the puzzle with the pieces of the puzzle that are from archives and collections in London and also a bit in Paris. So this is going to be a transatlantic journey today, and I hope it sticks together. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. So one of the things that inspired this project is this question of who determines how we remember revolution and how we define it. And I think this is a question of particular import in the United States at this particular moment, because we do have so much discussion around what should happen with how we remember wars and revolutions and civil wars. And I think that this old adage of history belongs to the victors is something that we're all well acquainted with. But I think it can be parsed out even more distinctly than that. And I was struck, I reread Trudeau's Silencing the Past recently, and I was very struck by the fact that what he's talking about really in some ways could be that history doesn't just belong to the victors, it also belongs to the victors within the victors, right? And so what I'm talking about today, in a sense, is who gets written out of the narrative, even the one that's controlled by the victors, even the people who were part of, in this case, the patriot cause, and yet are still effaced from our common historical record. And so what does that mean to our understanding of the revolution when we begin to plug those people back in? And to think about the American Revolution, and I should here apologize for using the word American in this very navel-gazing way that people in the United States of America do use it, with apologies to Mexico, which is also part of America. And, you know, disclaimer, but to say something like the war for independence every single time gets a little cumbersome. So with all due apologies for the political gaffe of referring to it as the American Revolution, that's maybe something we can talk about during the Q&A. But so who dominates the question of how we remember the art and the history of the American Revolution? And I'm sure that you've already had some things pop to mind and some people pop to mind. And these are two of the places in America where I would argue that narrative of what we should accept as what is the art that we remember and the artists that we remember from the revolution and that celebrate the revolution after the fact are really driving our common understanding. And one is, of course, George Washington's home, Mount Vernon, which is about as close to a pilgrimage site for the American Revolution in some sense as I think we can get to. And then the second, of course, is the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, which has their famous American wing, which was still in historical terms fairly recently reinstalled, right? And I want to take a quick look at some of the iconographic pieces that are in both of those spaces, Mount Vernon and the Met's American wing. And how many of you have been to the Met's American wing? So a fair number of you, right? So I have the people in this, this is a bad art history slide, by the way. No captions, they're all jumbled up. The reason I have that really bad picture of Washington crossing the Delaware is I wanted the people in it. Because the first thing that strikes you, right, when you walk into that American wing is this massive Washington crossing the Delaware, triumphant military history moment, flags waving, Washington improbably standing strong and tall despite the crossing in the teeny tiny boat. And the frame itself even is riddled with military iconography. In other words, go America, right? You can't escape this when you walk into the Met's American wing, and you're immediately given the message that American art is driven by this founding moment, by these important founding fathers who participated in the military conflict that gave us the United States of America. This is reiterated throughout the gallery. Interesting experiment I just did with my graduate students a couple weeks ago. We took a virtual tour of the American wing for a colonial American portraiture class. And everything that's colonial in that highlight reel that comes up online is related to New England and or a white man in some way, shape, or form. We could talk about that in the Q&A as well, right? And as I said, this is something that has been reinstalled in the 21st century. So this is not the same experience you get there physically, but online, you're still getting that familiar narrative. So at Mount Vernon, you of course get the story of the same story, right, but told through the singular figure of George Washington. And there's Charles Willson Peale's famous portrait, one of his famous portraits of him that's in the collections there. And then on the right, you have Jonathan Trumbull, his portrait of Washington. And then over there on the right, and it's sort of, I'm sorry, it's a little bit cut off on this screen, is a figure of an African man with a red turban on, who is often identified as William Lee, who was Washington's enslaved valet. So did everything from powder his hair to ride into battle with him during the American Revolution, shared a tent with him throughout the Revolution, except for the winter months when Washington was in a house with Martha, his wife. In other words, was ubiquitously by the side of George Washington, and yet most Americans have never heard of William Lee and have no clue who he was. And in this painting by Trumbull, he's shown in a very stereotypically artistic trope of Africans from the time. I don't even think it's, even though it's been identified as William Lee, I don't think it's actually a portrait of William Lee, who was always described as a mulatto and would not have worn a turban like this as a man of the Continental Army for another thing. So in other words, this is the sort of standard narrative that we think of when we think of art and artists in the American Revolution. You think of the military figures, you think of the Founding Fathers, you think of the Charles Wilson Peels, the Jonathan Trumples. There's been excellent work lately that's come out by scholars like Jane Kamensky and Paul Stady on John Singleton Copley and Benjamin West. So you even think about artists related to the American Revolution who purposely decided to not stay in America and instead stayed in London. But the people that you don't hear so much about are a number of artists who at the time were also important and also driving a lot of the narrative. And what I want to talk about today is why this is the case. And I think part of this is the case because the other people I'm going to bring in, their backstory is across the pond, back in London. And the other artist I'm going to discuss today, I haven't mentioned yet, is a woman, Patience Wright, who was a wax sculptor. And so this gets at issues of hierarchy of art as well as hierarchies of gender and race that inform what we choose to remember from the American Revolution. Because of course, in the hierarchy of art, wax is not nearly as good as painting, and within painting itself, of course, portraits are also not as up there as history paintings. And so the other two men I'm going to discuss today, Prince Dima and Robert Edge Pine, primarily are remembered for their portraits, and so they get knocked down on the hierarchical stratosphere there as well. But the reason I bring in Patience Wright and Robert Edge Pine is because oftentimes when we discuss the American Revolution as a transatlantic event, we focus on loyalists. So we focus on a diaspora of loyalist people who are essentially pushed or pulled out of North America and end up in Nova Scotia or in Bristol or in Sierra Leone, right? And we talk about enslaved people who seize their own freedom, inspired by things like Dunmore's Proclamation in Virginia in 1775, and who also are part of this movement and diaspora of people related to the American Revolution, and find that, freedom more often comes in the form of a red coat than a continental uniform, right? But what I'm going to do today is to sort of flip that narrative on its head and talk about people who are patriots, who are part of a transatlantic story. So people who are English, who are pro-American, like the painter Robert Edge Pine, and people like Patience Wright, who are patriots who spend the duration of the war in London doing everything from sort of really ineffectual attempts at espionage and information gathering to making political statements with the art that's on display in the Metropolitan Center there. And then also talking about, in this case, a formerly enslaved artist, Prince Dima, who is one of the rarer examples of an enslaved person who does find his freedom, in this case because his loyalist slaveholders leave the geographic confines of North America and he chooses to seize his freedom by fighting for the Patriots. So really emphasizing this sort of transatlantic history of patriots as a counter-narrative to the transatlantic history of the loyalist diaspora that we're starting to understand so well. So who are these three artists? Here's an example of the three that I'm pivoting among today. On the left, you see a portrait by Prince Dima of a Scottish-born merchant in Boston from the early 1770s. Now this does hang in the Met's American wing, but it's sort of off around the corner from Lutz's Washington Crossing the Delaware. It's very small, it's only about this big. And unless you read the label, you have no way of knowing that this is by a man who was enslaved at the time that he made it, right? So in a sense, he's hidden in plain view. His blackness is hidden in plain view in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Similarly, with Patience Wright, the wax sculptress I'm going to discuss today, she made hundreds of wax sculptures that were written about in newspapers, that were visited a lot by really important people on both sides of the Atlantic. And yet the only thing we can for sure say is attributable to her that still survives is this sort of marvelous wax figure of William Pitt, Lord Chatham, that she made in his parliamentary robes that is in Westminster Abbey, but is definitely within the canon of memorial art in Westminster Abbey, not on the same level as the marble statues, right? Wax is seen as not quite as artistically viable. And yet, she's a really great example of someone whose art has disappeared. And so I think that's part of the reason why she's written out of our standard narrative of how art drove the revolution from a patriot perspective, because like many things in revolution, her material record has been destroyed, right? Part of revolution is destruction. And in this case, a lot of her sculptures have not survived the test of time. And finally, the last artist I'm going to discuss today is Robert H. Pine, whose portrait of one of the Custis grandchildren of George and Martha Washington you see on the right there. Robert H. Pine, similarly, someone who in his own time period, much more widely respected than Charles Willson Peale, much better known than a Jonathan Trumbull, certainly. Like Benjamin West, won premiums at Society of Artists, Royal Society exhibitions. In his own time was widely touted as someone who had a great deal of promise. But he's not someone that we remember either. He's not someone whose name jumps to mind. In his case, in all of their cases actually, by the time you get to 1786, they're all three dead. And I think that's another important point here, is that one of the reasons Charles Willson Peale drives our narrative of art in the American Revolution is because he lived a long time, he had many children, and the man loved to write about himself. And so in this case, Prince Dima dies before the revolution is over, Patience Wright dies in 1786 in London, and Robert H. Pine, although he comes to America and paints these portraits, some of which are now hanging in the Washington's bedroom at Mount Vernon, and were when George Washington died. So as George Washington lays dying, he's looking at these portraits by Robert H. Pine. And yet, he's not, when you go to Mount Vernon, it's Charles Willson Peale, it's not Robert H. Pine, right? So, what I'm going to do for the rest of my time is go through each of these three people and hopefully parse out some of the reasons why I think they are very evocative of how people of color and women have been written out of this narrative of the history and the art history of the American Revolution. And yet they are hidden in plain sight, right? You can go to the Met, you can go to Westminster Abbey, and you can go to Mount Vernon and see their work, but they themselves are hidden as individuals who made this. So let's start with Patience Wright. So Patience Wright, shown here in a painting by Robert H. Pine, incidentally. These people are all connected. Patience Wright, seen here in a portrait by Robert H. Pine, a Quaker woman who went to London and sort of took the world by storm there for her wonderfully realistic depictions of the great and the good. And what's interesting about her is that she's an example of someone who capitalized on her sort of brash American identity to make her mark in the capital. And she's one of these people who actually got into trouble because of her patriotism, which I'll talk about in a minute. So Prince Dima, who is the first identifiable enslaved portrait painter in America, was held in bondage by this couple whose portraits he painted, which are copies of a Copley, Christian and Henry Barnes. And Christian Barnes here is another example of how women in this time period are really hidden within our standard narrative, because she's the one who pushes Prince Dima's career. She writes to a friend, "Prince is here, I'm sitting to him for my picture." She goes on to say that she thinks he could be just as good as Copley, her mispronunciation of Copley. So good does she think he is that she insists that they take him to London, where he studies with Robert H. Pine. So you have in the early 1770s this Boston mercantile couple bringing their enslaved young man to London to study with Robert H. Pine. She writes that while they are there, she's worried that Prince is lonely because she won't let him speak to anyone of his own color. And that is because the timing of their visit happens to be right up against the Somerset case, which also involves a Bostonian individual. So obviously the Barneses are a little worried that their talented enslaved portrait painter is going to get ideas while he's in London. And it does seem that he gets ideas because when the Barneses after a series of events that transpire once they return home, including the tarring and feathering of their horse, flee to London, he decides to stay in America and make a go of it as a patriot. Now, the man he studied with, Robert H. Pine, was, as I mentioned, someone who won premiums at exhibitions. So he was a classically trained, highly proficient, did history paintings as well as portraits. That's his portrait of George II in the middle there. But increasingly in the 1770s, he also starts to let politics drive his art. So although he was well known as one of the painters who most often portrayed David Garrick, who you see up there on the left, he also did things like go visit John Wilkes in prison and make his portrait there. And he also did things like multiple portraits of Catherine Macaulay, the historian whom you see on the top right. And he was really part of this coterie of artists in Bath in the 1770s who is very virulently Republican, which gets them into some political trouble. And one of the things I'd like to suss out is that I'm almost positive the reason they're in Bath is not for the waters, but because it's away from London and they can practice there. They have a sort of clique of Republican, political, like-minded people who express their politics in art, among other things. So, Robert H. Pine, one of the reasons that he might have taken Prince Dima on as a student was because his father was a man, John Pine, who was an engraver, well connected to the court of George II. He was the keeper of the seals. Among other things, he is the one whose name should be attached to Roke's famous map of London that you see down there on the bottom right. Although, again, here's the thing where, death really plays a role in how we remember history, right? Because he died right before Roke's map was produced, so it would have been called Roke and Pine's map. Instead, Roke got all the credit. So John Pine, if you look at him, I think you can understand why, in London at the time, it was widely believed, although he neither confirmed nor denied it, that he was of partial African descent himself. And in his portrait by Hogarth, which you see there, you can see that Hogarth is going to lengths to exoticize his friend John Pine here, shows him with the pearl earring. So in other words, this idea that you have, in this case, a man who's certainly of African descent being trained by a man who's thought to be of partial African descent in London around the time of the Somerset case, you can see where this is going, right? So how does Patience Wright fit into this? She's also personally connected, not to Prince Dima, but to Robert H. Pine. When her daughter, who also helps her with her art, gets married to a famous court painter, John Hopner, one of the two witnesses at her daughter's wedding is Robert H. Pine's aunt. So the other thing I'm arguing is that all these people are interconnected in ways that we more famously think of connections between the Adams or Jefferson, and incidentally, these people all knew all those people as well. But again, they're sort of written out of this standard narrative. So if we hop back across the Atlantic, when the Barneses' horse is tarred and feathered and they flee to England and Prince Dima sets up shop on his own, one of the things that comes into question here is how much he's part of this, I think, still understudied, vibrant community of enslaved or formerly enslaved artists in Boston. And so one of the things that's intriguing about Prince Dima is the question of whether it was he rather than Scipio Moorhead who did Phyllis Wheatley's portrait. And there are reasons to think that it might have been him instead. Both the fact that Wheatley and Prince Dima both spent time in London with this interconnected group of people. He definitely was advertising in newspapers that he was doing portraits at the time. In other words, I think there's a lot of digging to be done here. I think that there are this interconnected group of people of African descent who are part of this artistic community of Boston, as well as part of an artistic community in London, has a lot more players in it than just a Phyllis Wheatley or Scipio Moorhead. So part of what I'm doing here is to bring out these players who aren't as well known. So Prince Dima, when war comes, conflict comes to a head, enlists to fight for the Patriots. He is in a unit that is under the command of second in command Paul Revere. So again, he's sort of tiptoeing around all of these more well-known names. Now sadly, What he might have done in terms of chronicling the revolution, we don't know, because he died in 1778 as part of the smallpox epidemic that took away so many people in Boston. But as you can see, signs his name. That is the name that he signs to his will. And so he also has this wonderful piece of archival information that we don't have much of. And he's survived by his mother, Daphne, who, like Phyllis Wheatley, was born in Africa and taken over as a young girl to Boston. And what we have is her voice in the Revolution and after, seeking things like a pension from the Barneses who have resettled permanently in England. And so we have this intriguing glimpse through Prince Dean and his mother of a formerly enslaved artist, little snippets of the material artifacts and the archival artifacts he leaves behind, and this enslaved woman's voice coming through in a series of letters that she dictates to someone else. And so sort of bringing these people out of the shadows and linking them up to more famous people like Phyllis Wheatley and William Lee, Washington's enslaved valet, and really bringing out the richness of this community of people of African descent who were deeply embedded in these more familiar networks of revolution is part of what this project is about. And also highlighting, the important role that people who are pro-American and who are based in London are playing in trying to manipulate politics and in trying to manipulate public opinion through art. As war sort of fires up, Patience Wright changes up who you see in her wax works in her home in London, in Pall Mall. All of a sudden you see figures of Native American people. They weren't there before the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Now you see Native American people. So sort of the embodiment of America as Indian princess that shows up in everything from maps to prints. Patience Wright is embodying in her wax figures as well. She finally gets William Pitt to sit for his wax statue as a pro-American figure. She gets a John Wilkes out there. She gets Catherine Macaulay. So all of these people who are part of this very pro-American minority voice in English politics, she suddenly puts on display so people can come and get a three-dimensional experience of the people who were pro-American. She, though, falls out of favor because of this. One of the things she does is she had the ear of George III at a certain point, and this is kind of muddy, but one of the things she did was after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and I've been working in the Royal Archives and I'm trying to find a reliable primary source for this, but multiple people have a sort of, after the fact discussion of it. So I'm hoping I can find a reliable primary source. But she allegedly marched into George III and berated him for spilling the blood of his subjects at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. So not surprisingly, after that, she increasingly became persona non grata at the royal court, and she became firmly part of this pro-American political faction who was using her wax to make a political statement in terms of what you saw. Also allegedly was, according to her sister, smuggling information and notes out in the form of pieces of paper that she slipped into wax heads that she was shipping across the Atlantic for her sister to put on display in America. At the same time, Robert H. Pine also gets into trouble for his pro-American sentiments. He published this print on the right called America, which is an allegorical rendering of America in suffering and being helped by figures like Liberty. And this also apparently roused the ire of George III, and I think it's not coincidental that Robert H. Pine was sort of stuck in Bath rather than painting in court-related circles as he had been. And I have to say I had a sort of cynical view of Robert H. Pine coming to America because in the early 1780s, he asked George Washington's friend, George William Fairfax, who was in Bath as well, so another pro-American person sort of living out the war in England, asked him if he would write to Washington, and Fairfax did and said that Robert H. Pine was fired by the spirit of liberty and wanted to come to America to record the great epic of revolutionary history that was unfolding. And I always thought, Robert H. Pine, he wasn't making it in England, he wanted to go to America, he knew that there was no one who could touch him there. He probably never even heard of Charles Wilson Peele, right? So he goes to America, I'm thinking cynically, because he can make a quick buck. Well, I feel badly because I've since read some of Robert H. Pine's letters, and it's evident from as early as 1763-65 that he is very, very Republican by nature. He does not like hierarchy. He is a fan of egalitarian government in organizations. He is very pro-American, and he is fired by the spirit of liberty. So I apologize to Robert H. Pine for my cynical take on his reasons for coming. But so, as I mentioned, we don't know much about Robert H. Pine because he goes to America. He sets up what is actually a rival museum to Charles Willson Peale's. Robert H. Pine is given space in the Independence State House. He is financed by Robert Morris, and as I mentioned, he paints the Custis grandchildren, their portraits hanging Mount Vernon to the day Washington dies. So why don't we know about Robert H. Pine? This is his painting of the Declaration of Independence, which is a much less well-known version than Jonathan Trumbull's. This one is interesting. It's actually more historically accurate in terms of the architectural renderings than Trumbull's, which makes sense, right? Because Pine is painting in the State House. He can go downstairs and look at the space and paint it to do it. But his name doesn't really survive, and I think a large part of this is because he does die in 1788, and Charles Willson Peale cannot stand him. So Robert H. Pine has the patronage of most of the people who become part of the Federalist Party, so Robert Morris, George Washington, etc. Charles Willson Peale, of course, is someone who, as a member of the Continental Army and after during the war, is going and kicking people like the Galloways out of their house and absconding with their furniture, right, in the name of patriotism. So again, this is sort of like the victors within the victors. And in this case, they're all trying to chronicle America, but Charles Willson Peale gets the last word because he outlives Robert H. Pine. And everything he has to say about Robert H. Pine is negative because he couldn't stand him. Because Robert H. Pine was the big guy from London who swooped in and was capturing all these commissions. There's Pine's portrait of Washington on the right there. So the last thing I want to mention is the importance of women to this story. So not just Patience Wright herself, who is part of this circle, this transatlantic network of artists who are trying to further the American cause through the art they're producing, but also because women are largely subsumed within this narrative. So this is Patience Wright's daughter, who marries the famous English artist whose aunt, the aunt of Robert H. Pine, is a witness. So this is her as a subject by her artist husband, John Hopner. And yet, what she really did a lot in terms of with relationship to art was she helped her mother make those wax sculptures, but those wax sculptures no longer exist. What does exist is her as a subject, right? Not her as a creator. And I think this is very typical of a lot of women artists at the time. It's certainly typical of Robert H. Pine's daughters. He had 5 daughters, one of whom had some sort of mental or physical handicap, and so she wasn't involved with the art production. The other 4, though, one of whom you see on the right there, Charlotte, not only helped their father throughout his career, but also 3 of them exhibited at the Royal Academy in their own names in the 1790s, which is sort of unheard of. And yet they've also been lost in, the sort of standard narrative we have of women artists we identify who are related to the Royal Academy. Their names are not in the pantheon of the Mary Mosers or the Kaufmans, right? But they were also displaying and active. The other thing they did was they, like Patience Wright's daughter Phoebe, they actively participated in creating the art, but they did it anonymously. I don't know if you can see, I hope you can, there's a sort of edge around the face there, where there's a line, and it's on the other side as well. And the reason that you have those lines is that Robert H. Pine had a very unusual painting technique in America. He would paint out the face of his subject on a sort of circular oval piece of canvas, and then he would attach it to a larger canvas when he got home, and his daughters filled in the background and the bottom part of the clothing. So in other words, what you see here is celebrated as portrait by Robert H. Pine, but it's also about the hidden hands of the 4 Pine daughters at play there. One of the beautiful things about Robert H. Pine paintings, this is one that's at Mount Vernon, so it's actually pretty well conserved, but I've seen a terribly conserved one at the Maryland Historical Society, And since he's not a Charles Willson Peale, and he's not a Jonathan Trumbull, his paintings have not always been conserved well. In this case, that's wonderful because you can really evidently see the clear division between his handiwork and the handiwork of his daughters, who quite literally are in the background of these paintings, right? So what I hope to do with this project is to bring these people who are hidden in plain view into obvious sight, right? So when you walk into the Met's American Wing, when you walk into Westminster Abbey, when you walk into Mount Vernon, you're aware that Prince Dima is formerly enslaved portrait painter who was trained in London by Robert Edge Pine, and Patience Wright, this Quaker wax sculptor who makes it in London in royal circles, that all three of them are pro-American patriots who are largely written out of our story of how art drove the American Revolution, partly because they are people who exist outside of the geographic area that we privilege in terms of American revolutionary history. We don't often talk about what's going on in London in terms of the Patriots during the Revolution, but we should. And also partly because they are a victim of their own mortality, right? They don't get a chance to control the history that is told about them. And finally, last but not least, they are an example, they're only three examples of many other unknown and anonymous people of color and women who were active drivers and creators of this material culture and art that helped to create the revolutionary movement that founded the United States of America, but who were largely written out of our commonly accepted narrative. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Now let's welcome John Weir, who is going to tell us a little bit about Diego Rivera and various other artists in 20th century Mexico.
Might depend on my technical skills here. Well, thank you very much to everyone for coming, to Margaret for inviting me, to Stephanie Smith for proposing that I come. I met Stephanie some 15 months ago, and we both published very related books about the same time without knowing each other. And I'd like to talk our publishers into maybe bundling them together because they work well together, and I look forward to continuing to collaborate with her. Thanks to Byron for taking on the comment and discussions. And thanks to Sarah for her very interesting work, and for sharing the podium with a Mexicanist, for her sensitivity to the use of words that are so important. That might be a discussion for later. We were talking about the use of Latin America on the way over from lunch, and Borderlands folks sometimes like to talk about the Greater Mexico. I don't know if we could rename this as art and revolution in the Greater Mexico, but what I like to think about is the ideas of the Americas, right? It's that the transatlantic link is important, but I think the connection between the Americas, their common heritage, and the movement of ideas and people is a useful rethinking of the use of the word America. This is also a tentative work, and I relish the chance to share it with you. I've presented a couple small pieces, but this is my first attempt to think in bigger terms, and I really appreciate both your patience and your suggestions as I try to think this new project through. I'm tentatively, it's part of a political biography of Diego Rivera that I call, for now, Los Dos Diegos, and the title in some ways pays tribute to his now more famous wife and her most famous painting, The Two Fridas. There are interesting types of erasures, and one of them is that the woman known as Senora Rivera is now far more famous than her husband. I often have to explain to my students and colleagues, I teach a course on Frida and Diego, and They know about Frida, but they don't necessarily know about Diego. Part of that erasure also comes from the Cold War, I think, shifting from an age of revolution to an age of Cold War, where the type of political painting that Rivera did was largely forgotten or erased or categorized as propaganda. These two comments in some ways explain that. Diego Rivera, well, you can read this, these two very different visions of who Diego Rivera was, and they were written by the same person, by Bertrand Wolf, who wrote two biographies of Diego Rivera. The first one when he was a comrade of Diego Rivera in 1939, the second one when he was a Cold Warrior and Rivera was dead, and he rewrote that book, and he rewrote his thesis statement. Bertrand Wolf wrote the first biography after some 17 years of shared militancy on the transnational left. And then he rewrote his biography in 1963 after breaking with Rivera and the left, and he turned Rivera's life into a Cold War allegory. My first take on these two quotes was to simply reject the second, as rooted more in Wolf's transformations and contradictions than Rivera's. But what ultimately came to interest me is the changing nature of their relationship over time. And what it can tell us about Rivera and the experiences of the international left. I use their international comradeship, trying to think of a variation of bromance, maybe a commance, or I use this relationship to consider an age of revolution, one in which each played a central role in their national communist parties and in those of each other's country. This approach helps us consider revolution as part of a transnational project, yet one with distinct and changing realities and dramatically different individual and national outcomes. The divergence is clearest when, in the 1940s, these two ex-comrades ultimately chose opposite sides of the Cold War, a period which I will touch on only briefly today. Ultimately, I argue that for all of Rivera's multiple forms of artistic expression, his fables, his mega-ego, and opportunism, he cannot be understood as an artist without acknowledging his devotion, in the context of the Mexican Revolution, to radical politics and the belief that art can transform human relations. Wolf, in turn, becomes an emblematic figure, not so much for his flips on communism or on Rivera, but rather for the straitened context of revolutionary movements in the United States. Katarina Clark formulates the term perceptual millenarianism to describe the early 20th century international avant-garde in her study at St. Petersburg. The belief of these artists and intellectuals that, quote, the millennium could only be reached through a new vision or a new form of consciousness, and their attraction to the notion of revolution to some political movement that promised a radical transformation of society. The young Rivera and Wolf followed roughly comparable paths to the Communist Party. Born in 1886, Rivera's revisioning of the world began as an art student in Paris, where he was exposed to the Bohemian avant-garde. He first made his name with Cubism, certainly a perceptual revolution in the arts. But his political revisioning had to wait. The man who became the most famous artist of the revolution hardly featured a single peasant, worker, or made a direct social reference to Mexico in his 12 years of European painting. The main exception is a Cubist painting that features a sarape, sombrero, and mountainous background that later becomes mythologized with the title Zapatista Landscape. But one recent scholar makes an interesting argument that what this painting really is an exotic self-portrait of Diego Rivera, presenting himself to his Paris artistic counterparts and his rival Picasso. It's only in his last years in Europe that Rivera began to bridge the artistic and political vanguards. The Bolshevik Revolution and the exuberant leftist politics after World War II caught his attention, as well as the post-Cubist reckoning around art, which returned him to figurative forms and led him to contemplate public art and mass audiences. Soon his attention drifted to a dramatically altered post-revolutionary Mexico, where a new government supported agrarian and labor reforms as a response to previous and ongoing mobilization of peasants and workers. Rivera was literally summoned by Education Minister Jose Vasconcelos to play a key role in Mexico's cultural revolution. And within a year of his return, he was the most famous member of the newly formed Communist Party of Mexico. Bertrand Wolf was born in New York City 10 years later than Rivera and began his political activism in the anti-war movement. From there, he joined the Socialist Party and soon after co-founded the US Communist Party, learning his Lenin and Marx on the stump as a speaker, organizer, educator, and editor for the party. After the Palmer Red Raids, he organized clandestinely before fleeing to Mexico in 1922, where he taught English in a public school and joined the tiny Communist Party of Mexico, which he described as a party of revolutionary painters. Wolf downplays his role in his memoir, but his knowledge of Lenin and Marx and his association with the US Party gave him enormous influence. He led a coup of sorts and consolidated his role as the party ideologue. Soon after, he was sent to as Mexico's representative to the Comintern in Moscow, and his memoir is full of musings of passing as El Mexicano in the Soviet Union. On his return to Mexico, he played a key role in the first Bolshevization of the Mexican Party. Wolf's influence extended to Rivera. The older artist took him under his wing and showed him his country. Wolf writes, quote, "It was through his eyes that I first learned to see the visible world somewhat as artists see it, and to perceive Mexico's landscapes, people, and history as a succession of Rivera's." Wolf was in turn Rivera's political mentor. In 1922, Rivera was largely a political novice painting his first mural, the largely apolitical The Creation, which in many ways embodied the idea of a cosmic race promoted by Vasconcelos. Even his next mural, in the Ministry of Education of Indigenous Tehuanas, was in some ways a tribute to Vasconcelos' home state. But Rivera soon developed the populist and revolutionary style and narratives that would come to define his best paintings. Examples are Entering and Leaving the Mine in the Public Education Ministry, a denunciation of the exploitation of miners, and his paean to agriculture and agrarian reform in Chapingo, the new state agricultural university. These radical changes in content and style were intimately tied to the continued mobilization of workers and peasants, but they were also a product of his association with the Communist Party, where he became Wolf's disciple in political matters. This sometimes harsh tutelage led Rivera to briefly resign from the party in 1924 at Wolf's request, but Wolf's role ended when his involvement with an independent railroad workers' strike in 1925 led to Wolf's expulsion from Mexico. Within a year, Rivera requested and received readmission to the party. Rivera and Wolf almost overlapped in Moscow in 1928, each representing their distinct national parties. During his 5 months in the Soviet Union, Rivera was clearly moved by his first exposure to the mass organizations and to the ambitious state industrialization project, both elements that would shape his growing vision of proletarian art and enter into his subsequent mural projects, as he assumed many of the ideological symbols of Marxism-Leninism. These are evident in his final murals in the Ministry of Education on his return, where the workers are now mobilized, as in this portrayal of May Day, and the intellectual leadership that comes from the workers and artists of the Communist Party, including those on the right here, the Arsenal, with fellow artists David Alvaro Siqueiros, Frida Kahlo, and Tina Modotti. At the same time, Rivera in Moscow was exposed to the public tensions between Stalin and the recently exiled Trotsky, and caught up in debates about the role of art in revolutionary society. Rivera ultimately endorsed the October Group, which tried to open a space between socialist realism and the aesthetic avant-garde. While his involvement in debates about art may have led to his abrupt departure from Moscow, there is little evidence that his time in Moscow led directly to his expulsion from the Mexican Communist Party soon after he returned home. By contrast, relations with Moscow proved disastrous for Wolf. In 1928, he made his second and third trips to the Soviet Union as the United States representative of to the Comintern. Stalin had begun eliminating rivals and moving the Comintern toward the third period of a militant ultra-left line against the reformist unions and bourgeois governments. Wolf and U.S. Secretary General Lovestone publicly insisted that the Communist Party of the United States should be free to choose its own tactics and strategy. Stalin held Wolf and Lovestone captive in Moscow long enough for them to be purged from the U.S. Communist Party. Meanwhile, the Mexican Communist Party turned sharply to the left, provoking a break with the Mexican government that had in turn moved sharply right, outlawing the party itself. In this context, Rivera was expelled by his comrades in 1929 and labeled the house painter for the Mexican government. And indeed, Rivera was the only Mexican artist employed as a muralist by the federal government at the time. His epic narrative of Mexican history on the main wall of the staircase of the National Palace, in spite of a background of worker and peasant masses, has plausibly been read primarily as a nationalist celebration and a simulacrum of the Mexican flag, with the eagle on a cactus holding a serpent in its center. But the broader narrative here is that within 5 months of each other, Rivera and Wolf were expelled from their respective national communist parties. They would meet again in New York City in the early 1930s. Rivera's expulsion from the party made him more palatable to U.S. patrons. Yet at no point did Rivera stop being provocative. For example, a portable mural for his 1931 MoMA exhibition denounces the frozen assets of the unemployed and homeless in New York City. But his San Francisco and Detroit murals, while exalting work and industry, barely hint at worker alienation or class conflict, much less a project of social revolution, even though part of the inspiration likely came from Soviet industrialization and the related art. But when he was commissioned next to paint the Rockefeller Center mural, Rivera had something to prove. He painted Man at the Crossroads around a blonde worker at the center of a cosmos divided between a decadent capitalism and a hopeful communism. It was Rivera's insertion of the figure of Lenin that finally pushed his already nervous patron to stop and eventually destroy the unfinished mural. His provocations were certainly an attempt to address his communist critics, who now labeled him the house painter of U.S. capitalists. But the mural more subtly revealed his own evolving political orientation. Rivera publicly denounced Stalin and Soviet restrictions on art in public meetings in New York, and he found allies with both the right and left dissent to Stalin. One was J. Lovestone's right Communist Party opposition, in which Wolf was the second most important leader. At the same time, Rivera came into contact with the Trotskyist left opposition. In Rivera's destroyed mural, Rivera had inserted small profiles of Lovestone, Wolf, and the U.S. Trotskyist leader, James Cannon. Wolf's painted appearance suggests their collaboration on the mural itself, and it was Wolf, his opposition Communist Party, and their affiliated unions that led organized protests in defense of Rivera's mural, protests that the communists, for the most part, refused to join. But more significant were their post-Rockefeller collaborations. Rivera used the remaining Rockefeller funds to paint a mural for the New Workers' School that Wolf directed. Entitled Portrait of America, the mural conveyed a Marxist vision of American history from conquest to the present, a modest counterpart to Rivera's monumental National Palace murals. Rivera was clearly the artist, but Wolf, mobilizing all of the human resources of the school in his own considerable reading, was still the teacher, offering Rivera a crash course in U.S. history, something Rivera had barely touched on in his previous U.S. murals. Writing in his memoirs, Wolf shares both credit and blame. Quote, "For I was chief mediator between Diego and our history." Together, they determined the historical moments, personalities, and interpretations of U.S. history, looking at both the iconography of key figures and incorporating passages from their speeches and writing. Almost simultaneously, Wolf published a book that reproduced almost all of Rivera's U.S. murals, but most was given over to Wolf's extensive notes on and reproductions of the 21 panels of Portrait of America. Indeed, this collaboration may represent one of the most extensive and complex painted representations of U.S. history to that date, at least as a Marxist revision. Wolf begins his extensive accompanying text with a quote from Marx: "The history of all human society has been the history of class struggle." This was months before Rivera incorporated Marx bearing the same quote on the final wall of the National Palace. Portrait of America offers a more clearly Marxist interpretation of the past than the main wall of the National Palace. Wolf's text identifies two contradictory foundational principles that guide the mural's dialectic: the democratic equality and the right of revolution in the Declaration of Independence and Bill of Rights, and the distrust of the masses, acceptance of slavery, and protection of property rights in the Constitution. It's been a long time since I've read U.S. history, and I would be very interested if the sources for this interpretation, the Beards come to mind, but I would be interested to know what they might have, what Wolf might have been reading. Thus, for example, panel 2, The American Revolution, features Franklin as the great commoner and Thomas Paine as the symbol of a militant rethinking and cosmopolitan internationalism, while George Washington is on the margin, representing the continuities of a colonial ruling class. I worked hard to get that overlap. In subsequent panels, the long line of plutocrats and imperialists extends to Hamilton and Pope, and is countered by a libertarian strain embodied in different classes and moments, from the agrarian populist Jefferson to the utopian dreams and civil disobedience of Thoreau. Not too surprising is the attention the indigenous Rivera gives, the indigenista Rivera gives to Native Americans. More notable is the prominence he gives to African Americans and their leaders. Panel 6 on the Civil War features the militant or armed abolitionism of Frederick Douglass, Nat Turner, and John Brown, framed by Marx's assertion, labor with a white skin cannot emancipate itself, where labor with a black skin is branded. Brown, his uncompromising devotion to freedom and his executed hanging body overshadow Abraham Lincoln's hesitant moves toward the Emancipation Proclamation, while below, a living John Brown points a rifle at J.P. Morgan, who represents the conservative shift of the post-Reconstruction Republican Party. A series of panels juxtapose the U.S. labor movement inspired by Marx and led by such leaders as Eugene Debs and Big Bill Hayward, and made up of white and black male workers. Most immediately, Rivera celebrates the recent strike of the mostly female workers of the textile union, the most significant workers' organization tied to Lovestone's party. Others address the emerging forces of capitalism, imperialism, and fascism, and two panels explicitly address U.S. imperialism towards Latin America. First, the war of conquest against Mexico, and here, recent gunboat diplomacy on behalf of Standard Oil and United Fruit in Central America. In the upper right-hand corner is Sandino in Nicaragua. The final panel, Proletarian Unity, is a code of sorts to the destroyed Rockefeller panel. Again, Lenin joins together the hands of white and black workers, a farmer and a soldier. He is directly flanked by Marx and Engels. To his right, Stalin stares menacingly, while to his left, Trotsky's gaze is like Lenin's, direct and penetrating. They're joined by Bukharin, thus uniting the three tendencies in the communist movement of the Soviet Union. And in the left foreground, they are joined by the leaders who are their organizational counterparts in the United States. On the bottom right, Wolf, the teacher, points hopefully to an imagined show of unity among the working class through a reconciliation of leaders of the Marxist left, one of the goals of Lovestone's party. But for the rest of the decade, Rivera's political allegiance would vary from the path of reconciliation indicated by Wolf as Rivera moved quickly towards a formal affiliation with Trotskyism. Indeed, before leaving New York, Rivera painted 2 portable frescoes for the Trotskyite Communist League that shifted more fully to the perspective that would become his own. After his return to Mexico, Rivera repainted the Rockefeller mural in the Palacio de Bellas Artes, the Fine Arts Palace, this time inserting Trotsky and again Wolf. In effect, the mural was his public declaration in Mexico of support for Trotsky. He next completed the final wall, this monumental mural of Mexican history in the National Palace. It reflected both Rivera's journey and the new social effervescence of Mexico under the reformist president Lázaro Cárdenas, and arguably his only direct incorporation of Trotskyist ideas in his paintings beyond slogans and portraits. It diverged from his earlier nationalist and patriotic epic on the main wall and brought his global Marxism to contemporary Mexico. At the top, Marx points workers toward the socialist future with a quote that invokes revolution over reform. Class struggle, quote, is not a matter of reforming society as it exists, but rather of forming a new one. In the top right, Mexico City and its central plaza are literally on fire from the strikes and heightened confrontation of Cárdenas' first year as president. The mural differs from the images of Mexican communist artists from 1935, whose popular front representation celebrated workers' alliances with progressive allies and Cárdenas against fascists and ex-President Calles. Instead, Rivera offers an apocalyptic confrontation, one that suggests the overthrow of the old revolutionary order, arguably advocating for Trotsky's permanent revolution. Ironically, the hardline communists of 1929 who expelled Rivera now advocated broad popular front alliances with Cárdenas and progressive forces against fascism, while the expelled Rivera invokes permanent revolution. At a time when the Mexican Communist Party was experiencing its greatest effervescence and influence, and had even made gestures to bring Rivera back into the fold, as the Communist Party of the United States also did with Wolf, Rivera's alliance with Trotsky was hardly the easiest path. I don't have time to get into Rivera's Trotskyist militancy, and others have done it quite well. Rivera supported Trotsky's asylum in Mexico in 1936 and ultimately broke with Trotsky in 1939. But I do want to suggest here an alternative explanation to the better-known ones that focus on personal reasons, such as Frida's affair with Trotsky, or simply on Rivera's political unreliability. Rivera's Trotskyism was tied to his lifelong self-identification as a worker, his ongoing relations with labor unions, suggested in these 2 images, and his determination to be a player in national politics. Rivera supported and was a member of a handful of radical unions that refused to be contained by Popular Front politics, and a tiny nationalist Trotskyist party that questioned the limits on Cárdenas' reforms. He also endorsed the most radical possible successor to Cárdenas within the official party. These were roughly congruent with Trotskyist positions anywhere in the world, but they contradicted Trotsky's requirement to maintain political neutrality as a guest in Mexico, and left Rivera in an untenable position trying to mediate between Trotsky and Mexican Trotskyists. Their break was inevitable, and both political and personal. But instead I want to return to Wolf and Rivera. In spite of Rivera's Trotskyism, Wolf and Rivera sustained their friendship and collaboration through 1939. The book, Portrait of America, became a bestseller, and it led to another one, Portrait of Mexico, far less successful, perhaps because Wolf was not there for the most part when those original murals were being produced. Perhaps more important was his biography of Rivera, which I have written about elsewhere. The collaboration was long distance, fraught, and often mediated by their 2 wives. But the result is, I believe, arguably the most insightful biography of Rivera to date, because of Wolf's knowledge of and access to Rivera, his strong identification with Rivera, as a revolutionary and his emphasis on the revolutionary content of Rivera's murals. He celebrates Rivera's evolving vision from populist to revolutionary, and he writes of the National Palace murals. They represent something new, something only possible in our time and after the Russian Revolution. This must be recognized as Marxist painting's first completely self-conscious work, and Rivera is the world's most significant revolutionary artist. So for 17 years, Rivera's and Wolf's lives ran parallel as intellectual workers, communist comrades, and revolutionary rejects of the Communist Party. They maintained a friendship and political collaboration culminating in the Portrait of America murals and their subsequent 3 collaborative book projects. Wolf writes happily in his autobiography that Rivera showed him the way out of teaching high school, which was his main source of income in the 30s. Rivera fittingly painted Wolf 3 times as the, and by proxy, his maestro. But the year of the biography also marked an end to their friendship. The break was not just the result of the inevitable complaints of a living subject of a biography. Is this book about art and revolution or art and sex? Asked Diego Rivera. Was it inspired by Marx or Freud? Even more important was what might be called the death of revolution. Global events leading up to World War II, the rise of fascism, Stalinist purges, the assassination of Trotsky, the Stalin-Hitler Pact, the eventual Soviet alliance with the Allies, and the related conservative shifts in both Mexico and the United States proved disorienting to both. Rivera broke with Trotsky, briefly embraced a conservative dissident presidential candidate, collaborated with the US State Department in naming Mexican communists, and painted a final US mural in San Francisco that celebrated Pan-American unity. He repeatedly, but he was soon drawn back to the Communist Party. He repeatedly applied to rejoin and was finally readmitted in 1954. His provocative mural, The Nightmare of War and the Dream of Peace, was part of that reconciliation. In the top right mural, Stalin and Mao present a treaty for a ban on nuclear weapons to Uncle Sam, the UK and France, as the Korean War rages and a nuclear bomb explodes in the background. But perhaps more important is the massive portable mural, Glorious Revolution, that he painted soon after rejoining the party. It's a satiric and scalding denunciation of US intervention in Guatemala, the CIA's orchestrated coup that overthrew the reformist and democratic government of Jacobo Arbenz with the collaboration of United Fruit. Meanwhile, Bertrand Wolf gradually narrowed his affiliations with the left and unions and broke completely soon after the US entered World War II. He went on to become chief ideological advisor for the Voice of America during the Korean War, thus taking up the exact opposite position on that conflict as that of Rivera's War and Peace. Wolf ended his professional life as a senior fellow and prolific historian of the Soviet Union at the Hoover Institution. In his memoirs, he called Portrait of America the first writing I have ever set down between the covers of the worst writing, I have ever set down between the covers of a book. But it's really his own politics of the period that he rejects. After Rivera's death, when the copyright of the book expired, Wolf renewed it in his own name to prevent any publisher from reprinting it. Since many of the mural panels were destroyed in a fire, Wolf essentially censored the only remaining images of the series. Similarly, to prevent a reprint, Wolf bought out the rights to his first biography and rewrote it as a Cold War parable in which Rivera is a great painter, but no longer a revolutionary one. His greatest paintings are his folkloric ones that redeemed culturally the disinherited, impoverished descendants of the pre-Columbian civilizations. He denounces the cruelties of Stalinist Russia, and he notes the ironies of self-identified communist painters in the West, like Picasso and Rivera, who would never be allowed to paint freely in the Soviet Union. He calls Rivera's return to the Communist Party as a series of grovelings that indeed pervaded his entire life. And so, he concludes, Diego is a professional only in painting. In politics, he was an amateur and a passionate dilettante. I'll close here. I'm just beginning to think about the divergent Cold War paths of Rivera and Wolf. To what extent were they due to individual differences, and to what extent the different ways the Cold War was experienced in each country? Rivera's glorious revolution expressed not only the strong anti-imperialist sentiment of the Mexican Communist Party he had recently rejoined, but also that of a significant sector of the population that defended Mexico's revolutionary legacy in foreign policy and opposed U.S. interventions in Latin America, even in the face of the anti-communism and pro-U.S. policies of the current president of Mexico. Though much diminished, sedate, and chastened, the Mexican Communist Party still fought for social aspirations embedded in the Mexican Revolution, remained relevant among dissident groups of peasants, miners, and railroad workers, swore off armed rebellion, and often allied with the most progressive sector of a divided official Mexican Party of the Revolution. I'm still learning my U.S. history for this Cold War section, but my sense is that Wolf and many of his former U.S. comrades had much less margin for pursuing radical politics in the 40s and 50s. There was no recent and deep-seated revolutionary tradition that created space for an also much more sedate Communist Party. For Wolf, living in the belly of one superpower made it harder to ignore the sins of the other. It made it harder to see the parallel sins of U.S. empire in places like Guatemala. As late as 1963, Wolf still insisted that the Guatemalan government of Arbenz was overthrown by an anti-communist revolution rather than by the CIA. And it made it harder to see the continued potential for social justice and democratic inclusion advocated by a Marxist left. But these divergent Cold War paths are the subject of a different, as yet unwritten chapter. My focus today has been on the 17 years these transnational militants traveled together in an age of revolution. I tried to share some sense of their shared experiences, their shared aspirations for attaining new forms of consciousness and visual representation, and their experience joining political organizations aimed at revolutionary social transformation. Thank you.
We'll invite Byron Hammond to offer a few words of wisdom and to conduct a question and answer.
All right, I can just be here, I think, for now, maybe use that for the questions. So just I have just a couple of comments, since I assume the Q&A will be far more exciting. And of course, I'm going to try to point to parallels between the two talks as an integrating move. Of course, both talks involve a very exciting transnational cast of characters and perhaps a transatlantic revolutionary frame in both. The War of the 13 Colonies, of course, starts an Atlantic age of revolutions, which will last into the 1820s. And it's, of course, not incidental that the Mexican Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution overlap in time and reach their conclusions almost simultaneously. Both talks are not only about the art of revolution, but also the relation of art to the aftermath of a revolution, and the problematic relations between artistic production and the politics of patronage. Prince staying on in Boston in 1775 after his loyalist owners leave for Britain, Patience Wright and Robert Edge, Pine in the UK, but having problems of patronage because of their pro-13 colonies politics, leading Pine to move to Philadelphia, and on John's talk, Diego Rivera's shifting politics and shifting relationship to political authority in Mexico. So that kind of theme. I think this brings us to a key issue. Questions of art and revolution are, of course, part of a broader question of the relation of art to politics. Rivera, at least, wrote about this vexed issue directly. Lear mentioned Rivera's alliance with the October Group, which tried to mark out in the Soviet Union, which tried to mark out a space for committed revolutionary art that still maintained formal innovation, capable of assimilating past accomplishments while readapting them to the new socialist reality. And this apparently was a realignment in 1928. Almost a decade later, Rivera actually penned a manifesto on the relations of art and politics. Towards a Free Revolutionary Art was the title of the manifesto, and it was a manifesto article signed, at least, by Rivera and André Bertrand, that we saw a photo of, and it was published in Paris's Partisan Review in the fall of 1938. Now, the exact authorship of Towards a Free Revolutionary Art has been debated. Trotsky may be involved, unclear how much Rivera was involved. Trotsky was, of course, exiled in Mexico at this point, and John probably knows better the details of attribution now Towards a Free Revolutionary Art. But in any case, that manifesto actually argues for the importance of maintaining art's freedom from politics. And it ends, quote, the independence of art for the revolution for the complete liberation of art, exclamation point. Now, given these explicit discourses on the relations of art, politics, and revolution, of which, of course, there are many others in the early 20th century, do we find parallel discussions moving back in time in the 18th century, in the late 18th century? There are certainly a few discussions from 1790s revolutionary France of how art and politics should be related, thanks to Professor Andrew Shelton for his help here. The official catalog of the Paris Salon of 1793 began with a statement by Gazat, Minister of the Interior, about how, quote, the forms of the arts, like the political system, must return to first principles, to the imitation of nature. And later, it may seem strange to austere Republicans that we have occupied ourselves with the arts, while Europe in coalition assails the territory of liberty. So, these contexts, 1930s, 1790s, lead me to wonder, do we find parallel statements, manifestos about the ideal relations of art and politics a decade plus later in the artistic production surrounding the War of the 13 Colonies? Do Zara's three main characters ever say directly anything about this issue, ideal relations of art and politics? Do we have probate inventories from any of them that say what kinds of books they had and were reading? That could all be very interesting. In any case, of course, manifestos are one thing, and actual artistic practice quite another. But looking at the alignment, or not, of artistic revolutionary theory with actual artistic revolutionary practice could be quite illuminating. I was also intrigued, this is the final point, moving into questions, by two multi-sided art installations that showed up in each of the talks. In Zara's, we have what seems to be a kind of distributed waxworks museum. So it came up very briefly that there were accusations that Wright, I believe, was smuggling revolutionary spy material in waxworks heads to New England. Presumably for her sister was running a waxworks there. Do we know anything about that waxworks? It was very interesting, this discussion of after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the London display seems to have shifted. Do we know if there's a before and after shift also that's happening in parallel in New England? I'm also wondering, do we have any images of either of the waxworks installed from like tourist accounts? Do we have letters or other tourist accounts that let us sort of visit these spaces? Of course, one of the problems that was mentioned about studying Wright is that just basically one of her waxworks survives. But of course, as we know from science in the past, Trio has the beautiful examples of we've got a portrait of Frederick II, we've got a portrait of Dessalines, we have no portrait of Sanssouci, so the absence of an artwork is probably is perhaps a theme that could be useful when you go ahead and continue thinking about Patience Wright. Also, with the other two artists that Zara dealt with, we do have a huge corpus of material more than one waxwork, so it'll be interesting to look at what is the patterns within each of these bodies of work. It'll be interesting to do a kind of straight up art historical catalog and then study of that imagery. So that's the first kind of multi-sided art installation. The other had to do with the worker school murals from 1933, where we've got the image of Marx and his text with manifesto information on it, and this was pointed out, basically a very parallel image in the 1935 National Palace murals in Mexico City. It also seemed that Wolf has parallel books on the two sites, if I understood correctly. First, Portrait of America, about the worker school installation, and I was unclear exactly what is all uncovered in Portrait of Mexico, but it seems at least in part to deal with the National Palace murals, if I'm not totally mistaken. So, we've got two again, 1935, 1933, almost simultaneous at times, mass histories of nation states. The comparison of their iconography is partially gestured, and their differences is partially gestured to, at least in the paper version. But I think it could be very interesting, again, to do a kind of closer analysis of how these two murals are structured, how they represent their respective histories of the United States versus Mexico. And yeah, that is, so yeah, manifestos, multi-site artworks, that's all I wanted to really say. But now we can excitedly open to questions. Please, questions.
I have a mic.
Lisa, yes, thank you.
Do you want a mic, Lisa, or are you okay?
No, I don't think, it's a quick question. I was intrigued also by, if we're going to talk about connections between art and politics, art is actually transporting political messages in via these, scraps of paper and spy work. And is that, why aren't more of the wax figures extant? Were many used for this purpose? And I just would like to hear a little bit more about that practice. I'm actually watching Turn with my teenage son, who's, and sometimes I'm kind of, kind of working and it's on and he's enjoying it and I'm happy. And so there was an episode like that, and I wasn't watching the whole thing, I don't remember all the details, but there was a message in there. So I don't know if it's also like picking up on that because it happens so frequently, but I'm just curious about that as well.
Yeah, so the reason, sure. So the reason that those sculptures don't survive is, and actually interestingly enough, Robert H. Hines Museum gets purchased after his death and folded into another waxwork museum in New York, which burns to the ground in the 1830s. So bye-bye Robert H. Hines, as well as the wax figures. Wax, of course, is flammable, so that's a big problem in fire. And a similar thing happened to a lot of patients' rights statues. The other problem is that, again, it's just this really practical, they die, and what happens to this stuff, right? In this case, when Patience Wright died in London, her sister was still operating this parallel waxwork across the Atlantic, and got some of it shipped back, but not all of it. And the way waxworks were shipped was kind of intriguing because that statue of William Pitt, the head and the arms and the hands are wax, but the rest of it is usually wooden. And so it can be shipped in pieces. There's a funny story about Patience Wright. She also tried to set up a parallel waxworks in France, in Paris during the Revolution, when she was persona non grata for the politics in London. We got Ben Franklin to help her. And she was at one point coming back from where she visited Franklin and Plessis, crossing to the border to the city of Paris, and she was stopped by the guards, and they thought at first that she'd murdered someone because she had a head of Franklin that she had modeled and was bringing back with her. So that was not uncommon, and it's great we have a letter that recounts that from Alvin Walton, so we know that happened. But so I think because waxworks were sort of like the head could be attached to a different body, to different hands, they often floated around like that, so it was not weird for her to send back heads, sort of disembodied heads to her sister that she'd then stick onto another figure. And we know about the notes because her sister, when Patience Wright died in the late 1780s, kept petitioning Congress trying to get a pension for her sister's children because of the work that her sister had done as a spy. And so in both cases, for Prince Dima and for Patience Wright, we have the surviving women of the family arguing that they should be given these pensions for their patriotic service. So in this case, it's a matter of just the destruction of fire in this case.
If I could just pursue one question about Prince Dima.
Yes.
I wondered about the specific timing of how he emerged as an independent entrepreneurial artist. literally month to month. When did the Barneses give up and stay, or did they go back to back from Boston to London, or did they? Because
No,
I'm wondering about Prince Hall, who emerged
Yes.
as an independent, a major intellectual of the black community in Boston.
Yeah,
Probably knew each other, and artisan.
Right, this whole group of,
Yeah.
and I'm curious to think if you haven't, I think of them as a sort of, the Boston version of the Harlem Renaissance, but in the Revolutionary era, right? I mean, I'm trying to think of maybe Boston.
Well, then there's the question, Wheatley's book comes out in 1773.
Yes, exactly.
And I wondered whether what was the timing of him emerging as an artist? Would he be independent by the time he might have done that or not?
No, so what happened was the Barneses bring him over in 1770. They stay until late 1771. Then they go back to Boston. And then he sets up, he's still enslaved at this point.
Okay.
He sets up, they do let him set up shop though, and he advertises in papers, so we know that he's painting. And I think most of his portraits, like most portraits at the time, weren't signed, right? Wouldn't have been signed for the most part, so they're sort of,
So then he stayed in Boston during the occupation?
Yes, so
And
he
then
stayed,
they
he
leave
stayed in
after the
Boston.
occupation.
They left in 1775,
Oh,
after their horse was tarred and feathered.
so before.
And you probably noticed the portrait of Christian Barnes, the wife, had a rip in the chest. The portraits were bayoneted when the house was occupied. It was occupied by Henry Knox, their house. So,
So that was after 76, though.
right,
Okay.
so, but they left in 75, and then Prince Dima enlisted in, and I'm not remembering the month, but 1776. But so it's interesting because he opted to stay, right? And he declared himself, he dropped the Barnes, that's why his will, Prince Dima, free Negro, and Limner is how he described himself in his will.
Huh.
But yeah, you're right, this whole interconnected network of black intellectuals and artists in Boston, I think, is still surprisingly underexplored. And, but there's definitely, there's a there there. I mean, they are all interconnected. And the London piece is really crucial, I think. But thank you for that. I'm going to have to go month by month. I think that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if it's starting to shift to Rivera, but if I may, I got a quick question about the fallout between Rivera and Wolf. Especially since we know that Rivera had a big ego, I was wondering if we have anything in writing about how he felt about this lost friendship and the conservative turn by Wolf.
Yeah, I'm just starting to sort through those documents for the Cold War period. I know there was a bit of a fallout about the 1939 biography, right? But I think that had more to do with ego than politics. I know that their wives, who are very interesting people in their own right, you may have heard of one of them. They continue to correspond well into the 40s, but I haven't been able to find any kind of correspondence between Rivera and Wolf from 1940 on. Of course, that was often the case in the 30s, that it was the two wives who would negotiate, for example, around the first biography. And there are various references in the last years of Rivera's life, particularly reviews of the second biography that acknowledge this, that Rivera saw Wolf as a traitor, as an enemy. And Wolf, when Rivera enters the Communist Party, he writes an article, The Strange Journey of Diego Rivera, I think it's called, that basically denounces Rivera for doing that in his lifetime. So there's some fireworks there, but that's all I've been able to find at this point.
Yeah, thank you both for the presentations. I wanted to ask specifically about Diego Rivera, and I guess just to hear more about, Diego's positioning in these sort of theoretical debates within the Communist International. I find, that whole debate between socialist realism and more avant-garde views extremely interesting. I know you talked a little bit about that with the October group, but just to go into a little more detail, because I think it really highlights the part of the focus of this presentation around art and revolution. So I think that debate between socialist realism and the avant-garde and the commentary is really reflective of very huge political shifts. And it's just my personal view, but I think the ascendancy of socialist realism and Stalinism really was a sign of the degeneration of the revolutionary core of Marxism at that time. And I think Rivera inspires me just because I guess of his positioning around art in that conflict.
Yeah, no, there are some fascinating debates that go on, and they happen within Mexico, and there's some debates that definitely writes about as well between Siqueiros and Rivera, in which Rivera comes out as, I think, the more traditionalist of the two, and yet in 1928, I think he's well, I don't know that he's on the right side of the debate. He's sort of in the middle of the debate, as Byron sort of elaborated on the October group, advocating both a social function for art, a political function for art, and yet the openness to experimentation. And he pursues that again in the early 30s in New York City, and then as in the co-authored piece with Bertrand, he advocates that as well. I think in general, Mexican artists are saved by a couple things from the demands of socialist realism. One is that they are generally painting in an oppositional way, in spite of their close ties to the government. And even when they use mostly figurative art, they're using it in an interesting way to challenge the status quo. And whereas, and I don't know, I'm not very deeply schooled in socialist realism, but I was in Russia for the first time and spent some interesting time in museums and was thrilled by the avant-garde and very quickly bored with the socialist realism, right? So in one place you're celebrating a socialist paradise, and the other you're critiquing the current system, though you often have aspirations to that socialist paradise, as you saw in the last wall of the mural. But the other thing that I think really saves the Mexican artists who are attentive to the messages from Moscow is that they have this wonderful, extremely creative tradition that, particularly Jose Guadalupe Posada, right, a pre-revolutionary artist who's sort of, I guess, to use a cliche, that sort of magic realism of his images of calaveras and almost surreal, in the same, before the avant-garde, as they say. So you see that in all of Mexico's political art throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And I think that's also a salvation. You see it in Rivera less than others, but it's still very much there.
Yeah.
What story is Rivera communicating with glorious victory? That looks like a lot of symbols. And,
Yeah. Well, in some ways it's part of this global story of the Cold War, but it it's much more meaningful to a much broader audience because you don't have Father Lenin there. Instead, you have the Dulles brothers here on this bomb.
is that a particular figure out of history?
This one, yes, absolutely. So this is Guatemala. Guatemala had a social democratic revolution in 1944, inspired by the Allies, by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. And when it began expropriating the property of the United Fruit Company, then the United States Congress and the State Department and the CIA saw communism there. And of course there were communists there because that is one of the roles that
the democratic roles that communists played in the post-war in promoting reforms, right? So that led to a CIA orchestration of a coup around this figure here, right, who had no real following, but with the support of the United States military behind him.
Was that figure the head of installed by was he being supported by our government?
Exactly. He was supported by our government. He was funded. The dictators in Honduras and Nicaragua supported him, and he became the first president after the overthrow of our banks. Right? His allies included the Guatemalan Church and all the conservative landowners and the United Fruit Company. And this was a huge event. It was sort of the first post-good neighbor Cold War sally of the United States, beginning of a bunch of interventions. And so it was hugely important for the Latin American, very broad Latin American left of the United States would do this. They would try to do the same thing. They had pigs.
So Eisenhower was doing this at the behest of the United Fruit.
That is one element with a lot of support. Yeah. The others, other interpretations is part of this Cold War ethos in which the United States saw a challenge in Latin America from the left to the status quo as being perpetrated by the Soviet Union.
So this is art communicating.
Exactly.
Yeah, I wonder if we could just pose a question to both of you, or all three of you perhaps, which is the sort of big question of revolution and patronage, artist, revolution, and patronage. And I guess I see an escape from patronage in Diego Rivera, though he is getting money from the government of Mexico. I wonder about patronage and revolution and art. I'll leave it to you to figure out how to deal with that. But I wonder about how the ways in which maybe Peale is effectively becomes the painter of the, it becomes maybe the artistic Bertrand Wolf of the 1790s. He becomes the painter of the establishment, having been the super radical on the streets of Philadelphia in 75, 76. I don't know. I just throw that out there. The problem with the value of art, the investment of art, the need to make a living, and the need to advance a revolution, perhaps becoming corrupted in the aftermath. I just throw it out there.
Yeah, so we go chronologically. I thought that was a great point that you brought out about patronage and its effect. And yes, and I think that it is a very important question in terms of, following all three of these people that I'm tracing, right? The issue of Prince Dima, it's the patronage of, and I think it's also important to note, women are playing crucial roles as patrons here too, which is part of the story here that I think it's important to draw out. That it's only because his slaveholders want to take him, they give him the patronage to bring him to London that he gets the training. And then I often think he must have been like Charles Wilson Peale was when he was enlisted and been painting miniatures and painting portraits of his fellow soldiers. But again, since he dies in 1778, we don't have the physical record. But I would be, 100% willing to bet my reputation as a historian that he was doing that, because he was painting up until that moment. So why would he stop when there's a demand for that among men fighting the war, right? And then thinking about Patience Wright, it's the patronage of Benjamin Franklin that gets her the entree into London society. It's the loss of the patronage of George III because of her politics that sends her to France and that kicks her down that different direction in terms of what she's displaying. And in terms of Robert H. Pine, I think absolutely patronage is crucial here because, as I mentioned, I think this is something that is very important to parse out that we overlap in, which is the importance of parties within revolution driving who's in charge of the narrative too. Because in the case of Robert H. Pine, I think it's partly because, as I mentioned, I think he's the Federalist painter, right? Charles Wilson Peale's more aligned with the Democratic, what becomes the Democratic Republicans. In in addition to the Washingtons, and again, Martha Washington is the first patron, not George, of Robert H. Fine. She's the one who commissions the grandchildren, right? In this case, his patron is Robert Morris. Robert Morris gives him a house to live in for free, sets him up at the State House with the museum. And of course, we all know Robert Morris, falls from being the great financier of the American Revolution to going bankrupt, right? So again, I think if you have the wrong patron, if your patron goes bankrupt, where are you, right? So I think it's absolutely critical, and I think it is all tied up with which party is in control as well. So I think that these are all really important points to bring out.
I guess for patronage is always a key question, and in Mexico, patronage has been monopolized by the government for so long, and you see that before the revolution. In fact, Rivera spends his 8 years in Mexico with a scholarship from the pre-revolutionary government, and then suddenly he's forced to compete with Cubists in selling his paintings. So and then, of course, he becomes the house painter of the government and around a whole group of artists who in many ways depend on the government for jobs teaching, to pay the rent, and then the occasional commission that he tends to monopolize. And of course, he moves on to depend upon capitalist patrons. But a couple of things. One is he is always provocative. It varies from painting to painting, but in various moments he has no problem sticking his finger in the eye of his patron. There are also artists that have different sorts of patronage or are much less dependent on patronage than Rivera is. Right? Frida Kahlo, for one, right? She's painting for herself until well into her career. The artists who don't get commissions once Rivera has monopolized them, a lot of them sort of move out into other art forms, forms of protest, self-funded. The print tradition, which I deal with a lot in my previous book, is an alternative there where where patronage almost disappears as an issue, and of course that brings its own set of problems with it. And then they also paint in different places, and I think Rivera, the one real exception here is the New Workers' School. Right? He's using Rockefeller's money, and he's painting it with the participation of workers at that school. He's painting it for unions, and this happens a lot in Mexico with other artists, particularly in the 30s. They take their art to other places, and their patrons become labor unions, for example. So in some ways that can be very, very exciting. And then a final project that has just never really developed very well in the Mexican Revolution is bringing art to the population itself and giving them the possibility. There are various attempts at that, but it doesn't go very far. The last thing I would say is just that Rivera earned tons of money. There's a whole other group of paintings of portraits of U.S. Elites and Mexican elites. But he was also extremely generous with that money. He never, using the Rockefeller money, for example, the money he got from Ford, a lot of it he gave to local unions. And that's sort of where the hidden class conflict occurs. He was working closely with unions. He was Mexicans who were being sent back to Mexico, being deported during the Depression. He bought a lot of their tickets. Different groups on the left were constantly coming to him, and he died broke. Part of it because he was building a mausoleum for his art and his pre-Columbian artifacts, but he was always giving away his money.
Your question just reminded me of Leora Auslander's classic essay Beyond Words from American Historical Review, where part of it is about much of the discourse and formal artistic practice of the French Revolution is about public space, and she's interested in what's happening in private space with decoration of houses. So she brings up examples like a
very fine mahogany chair with a freeing cabinet, for example, or porcelains that show the three estates in them. And she's interested in how obviously the person designing the mahogany revolutionary chair was designing monarchist, surely, since you have all these skills and exotic materials, furniture before the revolution. There's sort of a continuity there in practice, even though patronage or the kinds of symbols one should be representing is shifting. So too with porcelain. Porcelain had obviously been established before the revolution, but porcelain manufacturers then shift the iconography within their own industry. So in this case, the imagery changes, but there's a sort of stasis. There's not a revolution in the modes of production, but that's just an example to address your question. Other questions? Yeah.
Sure, I have the mic, so I have a question. Well, I was struck by the theme of the competition or termination of careers, or destruction of archives by the survivors, the people who become the more public faces of art and revolution. But I also started thinking about transnational versus national revolutions. Is it about party within revolution, or is it about so this Wilkesite Bath group? You know, that's a moment where revolution within the British Empire is about reform of England as well as America, right? So it is really a transatlantic project. But the American Revolution that puts a stop to that moment and renders those people in a difficult political position marginally within England. So France offers the next option, but that marginalizes many of the Anglo-American figures who get involved with it. Pain's a forgotten power too, you know. So you know, the revolution quickly becomes a national rather than an international project. And the Guatemalan mural made me think about that too. You know, is Rivera moving towards abandoning maybe some of this notion of a national revolution? I mean, it's clearly in that 1952 mural still, but is there a sense that a national revolution being something distinct, a revolution in the Americas perhaps being distinct from these older transnational models, that might also be part of the marginalization of some of these artists who have been involved with a particular transnational vision that is not necessarily the vision that's going to get played out by the 1790s and into the early 1800s, and then perhaps after 1950 and the Americas.
No, I mean, I think that's exactly right. And I think one of the things that's interesting is if you're looking at people who all die before the French Revolution happens, right? Then, in a sense, they get to avoid that whole issue because they're all dead by 17.
The patience is trying to join the French Revolution.
Yeah.
You know, that would make sense in some ways, right?
It would absolutely, but you know, they die in 1778, 1786, 1788. So what you see is almost like they die before the American Revolution becomes the Age of Atlantic Revolutions, right? So it's like, speaking of stasis, right? They're like frozen in this revolutionary stasis where I mean, the Pine daughters end up going back to England because they can, right? They're not anything crazy at that point. No. But I think it's like these are like the cosmopolitan transnational revolutionaries that Janet Pulaski traces in her book, right? But Revolution Without Borders. But in this case, it's, you know, they die before they need to cross borders because. So I really do. I mean, it probably sounds very bizarre to say. I've been obsessing about death and how important it is, but I think it is critically important, you know, in terms of when people die and who then controls the legacy of how their work is considered. I mean, I was thinking of in your case, right, that I think you're right that Wolf is like the Peel for Rivera, right? And I think it's a great analogy, and it is true. What a better way to, you know, to control your take of the story, to be the one who outlives the other person, right? You get to write it down. So I think that all is playing into this too. I think timing is critical. But yeah, I think thinking about this group in Bath, I think you're absolutely right, because they're so excited. There's this moment where they think all of our Wilkesian principles are going to blossom, and it's going to be, you know, republicanism across the empire, and then of course that all is terribly wrong, and they are disillusioned. And, you know, so I think look at these pro-American people in England. They haven't really been considered as but they are sort of the equivalent of Pulaski's people.
Yeah, I found this interesting set of exchanges after Wolf's book comes out, and he's trying to promote it, and he's trying to send it everywhere. And he also has an exchange with Elia Kazin, and he's trying to sell his book as this parable of the Cold War, and they're talking about Zero Mostel as possibly playing Diego Rivera, and Elia Kazin, we know his own encounter with the House Un-American Activities Committee, and it's an interesting way that he's trying to take ownership of Rivera's story, and in some ways he does, because people who look to read a biography of Diego Rivera read the most recent one. But there's another part of it too, and that's both the way the Mexican government becomes more nationalist and conservative, and has its own sort of version, much gentler, but its own version of the Cold War, right? And Rivera's reread is mostly nationalist. The top one was very provocative, and it was a government commission to send to Paris, but the government said, no way you're sending that. Right? So it was sent to the Soviet Union, and it disappeared for many years. But the bottom one fits quite well within the progressive foreign policy of Mexico in the Cold War, right? Which was part of the way it could be increasingly conservative national. So in that sense, there's a coincidence of messaging there. And the other sort of Cold War aspect I would mention is that in general, the muralists became more museum pieces in this period, even the younger generation. And the United States plays a very influential role in Latin America and also Mexico in pushing abstract art as opposed to figurative art. So there were lots of restless Mexican young artists who were more than happy for them to happen. So that's part of the story erasure as well.
More questions? Right.
Well, I'd like to thank all of our participants, and thanks Martin for that excellent comment that I thought really pulled together the papers and suggested a lot of new arenas for inquiry. So thanks everybody for coming. We're nearing the end of a 2-year program by the Center for Historical Research, focusing on revolutions, called You Say You Want a Revolution, Revolutions of Historical Perspective. We have 2 more speakers upcoming in April. Marcela Echeverri will be talking about Afro-Latino and Indian indigenous royalism and loyalism in wars for independence in South America. And Bill Joseph will be talking about revolution in modern Latin America, which I think will be a spectacular end to our 2-year program. Also like to acknowledge the support of the Department of History of Art and the Center for Latin American Studies for today's program. Thank you.